Hello, it's Writing Wednesday, and today I'm going to be talking about time and not how you handle your time, that's a different matter, but how we handle time on the page. I got two questions this week. I've gotten two questions this week about how do I handle time in my fiction. Tell us your your thoughts about time and chaptering. Hi, Brandy. And some of my chapters are backstory and cover years. Some chapters are a day or weeks. Love to hear your thoughts. And then someone else said that he's been struggling with conveying time in his writing. Hi. Do you have any tips for gracefully covering the passage of time without constantly relying on phrases like the next day or later that afternoon, etc.? So two different questions about time coming up in the same week. I figured, oh, these people, this is just meant to be. So let's talk about time. Let's get rid of this. As sands through an hourglass, so are the days of our lives. Well, first I'd like to talk about the how to convey time, the passage of time. Normally, the line break is the double space is your friend. To convey a break in time, you simply space down and keep going into a new scene. When you think about when you watch a movie, there's a cut, you're in a new scene. How do you know that it's not the same day? The weather is different. The time of day is different. If you've had a tough night scene in one, and then a person working at their desk in a next, you know it's not the same day, and you imagine that time has passed. That's what that blank space means. Time has passed. Now, I think that often writers, we care a great deal if it's been 3 days or a week or 2 weeks or whatever. But oddly enough, the reader doesn't care that much. It's like to describe a room, we picture the desk on the left, the bed on the right, because it helps us keep the scene more closely in mind. But the reader absolutely, I guarantee you, does not care whether the bed is on the right or the left, and it gives them too much to keep track of. So my basic take is, if it doesn't matter if it's 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later or 2 months later, if it doesn't matter, put a break or new chapter, whatever, and describe the scene. You describe the light. We know if the last scene or chapter was in spring, and now we're talking about the July heat or the summer heat, we know that time has passed. So in general, I believe in landscape. The more you do the landscape, the more you do the weather, the more you're able to look at light and seasons, the better off you'll be. Because then you do a simple landscape description, and we know we're not in the same scene as before. We know we're in November because the heavy November skies. Oh, okay, time has passed. So that's a very elegant way to do it. Now, what's difficult is when you have a chronological story in which time is very important, not just time passing, but the actual timing, dates. Working on a historical novel, talking about the Russian Revolution, within 4 days in February 1917, tremendous things happened, and there were different, each day was very different and historically documented. I can't just go a couple days later or the next day, whatever. I mean, it is, February 23rd or it's February 24th are really important. I thought I'd show, usually I don't talk about my own work because it's kind of, you want to suggest reading as well and stuff. But this makes it easy. I'm just really familiar with this material. And I had the same problem. How do you indicate time passing in different ways? So I just thought I'd do some of the tag ins and tag outs, how it works. So we start on International Women's Day, 1917, which was the beginning of the Russian Revolution. You can't miss that one. It's a real date. So I just simply started the chapter in the midst of the terrible winter of 1917. After weeks of 30 below zero, here's my landscape coming to my aid, the weather suddenly turned fair. So we're on a day now, really specific. Overnight, thermometers soared from 4 below to 40 degrees, just in time for International Women's Day March. Had the weather not cooperated, who knows whether events would have unfolded as they did. The short, warm spell changed the world. And what is history? Is it the trace of a footstep in wet cement? Is it the story of important men in smoky rooms or on battlefields? The inevitable outcome of great impersonal forces? Or is it a collision of chance events, like the sudden rise of the mercury on February 23rd, 1917? Boom! Writing a historical novel, I had to do the dates, not just on Tuesday and now we're on Wednesday. I had to really peg this. So then moving on to another version of moving dates around. We're on the night of the first day of the revolution, and then I have to get us to the next day. Or we're on the day of the revolution. We're actually at that Women's Day March, and then I want to show that night. So how do you go from day to night? Do I have to say that night? No. I have a character say, "You should have been there, Mama," Mina said, slurping up the golden broth swimming with noodles as steam coated her glasses. There we are. We're at dinner. It's just a landscape and action, and immediately we know we're not on the street watching the march. Then we go from the revolution as a topic to a dinner or luncheon with two elderly aunts when all this is going on. So that's where you bring in your 2 days later, the two Marias. 2 days later, I sat with Mother at a table for 6 at the Hotel Europa. There we go. And the absurdity of going from the revolution to 2 days later at the Hotel Europa, the change of locale, the landscape, makes that memorable. We're suddenly somewhere else at a different time. Then we get out of the dinner with the lunch with the two elderly aunts, and that's an afternoon. Then the next chapter begins. In the watery gray first light, the sidewalks already exuded a bristly, nervy energy. So already we're early in the morning. Do we know whether it's the next day? Probably not. I will eventually say in this, we get up in the watery gray first light, the sidewalks already exude. So we already know that time has passed. So the reader is probably trying to figure out when we are, because the revolution's breaking. So I wake the Marina wakes her brother up, determined to spend the day at the demonstrations. After our luncheon at the Hotel Europa, I needed no urging. So I don't have to say that the luncheon was yesterday. I just think about it. And then I know that it was yesterday after our luncheon. Let's see, how else do we handle this? My character goes to a demonstration. Bad things happen at the demonstration this time, and then I start a chapter on the same day, on the evening of the same day. So how do I show that? We come home, so we've just seen something really terrible. New chapter. I didn't remember coming home, but people stared at me with the blood on her and so forth. So there we are. We know she still has the blood on her. It's going to be right after that demonstration. Friend comes over in the middle of the night, radical friend. She's decided she doesn't want to have anything more to do with the revolution after what she has just been through. But this friend comes over and she is super hopped up, middle of the night. She sleeps over. She says, better get some sleep. It's going to be quite a day tomorrow. That's how the chapter ends. New chapter. The next thing I knew, Varvara was shaking me. The clock read 7 a.m. There we go. Now we still know where we are. We're the following morning. I don't have to say the following morning. She's shaking me. Wake up. Then what's another one? We have something happening during the day, and then the beautiful double break like that, which means time passes. Then the next sentence is, after dark, Solomon Mosievich came home. So a friend's father, they're kind of tucked up at a friend's house. So after dark, again, observing the light, observing the calendar, observing the sensual reality of the seasons and times of day will do this for you. Let's see. Gunfire, here's a chapter. The end of chapter, she stays over at the friend's house that she's tucked up to stay off the streets. Well, there's actual street fighting going on. Gunfire sounded throughout the following day. So I don't have to account for every minute of that time. Just you can expand this. This speaks to the other question of some chapters cover years, some chapters cover a short amount of time. Gunfire sounded throughout the day. That gets you into the scene. That's the live, real-time scene that I'm going to do here. But I don't have to have them wake up and hear gunfire and eat breakfast and hear gunfire. And you go to the live scene, but you help the reader, just little signposts where we are. So gunfire sounded throughout the following day. How else do we do it? Now, she's holed up at a friend's house for 4 days as there's actual street fighting. Live ammunition. We're kids and we're staying off the street. We are looking out the window. We see what's going on. On March 2nd, against the revolution, so I have to peg it. on March 2nd, our 4th day at the Katsevs, Father came to fetch me. We know where we are. I don't have to, tie myself in knots. So sometimes I will actually say that 4 days later because it's important. If it's not important, just a little break. The reader doesn't care if it's a week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later. Unless it's important to the story, just break. Now I have a big break. I have the character has gotten in a fight with her family about the revolution. She's pretty radical, and she's a kid, so she's trying out to see how people react to her radical talk, and she's sent to the kitchen. It's not good. Now, how do you do time passing? The next chapter, she talks about what it's like to live after the revolution, and the things she described it's not about a single day. It's how we live after the revolution. It's like this, and it's like this, and you do this, and you do this. So we go into a more general time, where you can say that time is passing by giving it a flavor. What is the feeling of living through that particular month or that particular couple of weeks? And then when I need to peg it to an absolute date, because this is historical fiction, then I can go and zoom in on a single date. But we know generally where we are. Then it's important to know what kind of, when you peg it to zooming in to certain events puts you at a specific time. So we are generally after the revolution, then we're walking with friends to a radical meeting. In the half-light, it was still bright enough to see the color of the girls' spring coats. So it gives you the light. It gives you, we're in spring now. The revolution is back in, late winter. So we're in spring now, and we're having our spring coats. So there I'm giving you where we are in time. But also I can flash back, and that was another question that related to time that somebody had. That, like, how do you don't have to just march forward, boom, 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 boom. Things remind people of other things. So you can go back and fill in if you want to jump ahead in time for a real-time scene. This is going to be spring, and she's going to this radical meeting, a big, it's not a demonstration, but it's a big meeting at the Cirque Moderne. It's the center of radical speeches. So she and her friends are going. But there's an event that happened that I want to make sure is part of people's understanding of when we are and where we are. So I go back. We're walking ahead. We're crossing the field of Mars in St. Petersburg, in Petrograd, revolutionary Petrograd, which is where the soldiers march, and the burial of the martyrs of the revolution that's just taken place in February. So I go back. Seryoja, her brother, lagged behind, thinking his own private thoughts. Here. And now we're crossing the field of Mars. Here on these broad parade grounds, we'd sent Kolya and Volodya off to war. That was 1914, so 3 years earlier. Here we'd buried 184 martyrs of the revolution just 2 months ago. So, boom, we know where we are. It's 2 months since the big demonstrations and the abdication of the Tsar and all that. So just 2 months ago, a solemn day, I would never forget the sight of those coffins, blah, blah, blah. And then I'm back to the current moment as somebody speaks. When anybody speaks, you're in a real-time scene. So she remembers, and then she's back in the real-time scene. You know, she's in a time where she's giving her parents problems. It's any revolution, fathers and sons, it's going to be generational. So giving her parents problems, she's kind of been locked up. And that evening, I heard my father and mother quarreling. So time is passing. You get your little break there. See, little break. I heard my father and mother quarreling. So now we know time's passed. And now there's another little break. So we had one here, and then that was about a day. We have another break here, and on the fourth day of my comfortable imprisonment, blah, 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 Miss Haddon Finch comes in. So we know that next little break is a 4-day break or 3-day break. And she's been in there for 4 days. So sometimes it's important to keep track of exactly where you're at 4 days later. Sometimes it doesn't matter if, you just indicate by the next thing is happening, and it doesn't really matter whether it's a month later or 2 months later or 4 months later. It's just later. Sometimes you want to keep track, and it doesn't always have to say, 4 days later. You can just eat the soup after the revolution, and that time's passed. So, and you can go backwards. The important thing generally is to keep the time and place together. We talked about the Aristotelian unities when we talked about scene and story and scene. A scene is something that happens in one place at one time. So you want to have a real-time scene, and then that's the actual time of whatever it is, a story or scene, or rather a chapter or a scene. That's your real time. And then if you want to remember and bring in something, it reminds somebody of something, then you just go back. That reminded me of when we sent Kolya and Volodya off to war. And you can spend a little time back there. And then you come back into the real time of your live scene. So you can work a lot of different time periods that way. There's no time in the mind. Our memory is as real to us at what's going on right now, and often more real. So there's fluidity in the character's point of view, and you should write in point of view. You are the character, you are your protagonist, and then things remind them of other times, and it's going to happen all through your day. It's going to happen at all times. So time is very fluid. It has to be pegged at the present moment in the live scene. So that's you can gracefully cover the passage of time without constantly relying on phrases like the next day or later that afternoon. But there's nothing wrong with them if you need them. Just don't start every chapter or every scene with that. See if you really need it. See if you can do it elegantly with light, with landscape, with, the other elements. Then there is the question about chaptering, time and chapters. Some chapters are backstory and cover years. Some chapters are day or weeks. Love to hear thoughts about that. Well, this is a question I would say is going to be more about rhythm then about time. The rhythm of the scenes and the rhythm of the chapters. If all your chapters tend to be, say, are progressing very chronologically, and then suddenly you're going to have something wildly out of order, or you're going to have a single day or moment, that's going to be a little jarring to the reader. It might be a good idea to do more of it rather than less, so it's kind of like putting that style in the blender so that you see more of that if certain chapters or scenes are simply going to be, bam, flashbacks. You want to have more of those rather than less, so that it's not going to just appear out of the blue in page 90. I think that the opener, the way you set up a book, and the rhythm of the scenes, rhythm of the chapters, is a contract. You're setting up a contract with the reader in the beginning of a book. And so you don't want to set up a sort of a contract of how this book is going to be told and then completely shatter it. Most people just like, what the hell? That said, if it's good, all bets are off, right? So I'm never saying don't do this, because for every don't do this, there's some brilliant one of you who's going to be doing it gloriously. And, there's no reason to, be, fascistic about this. But in general, if you're having questions, you're already doubting whether this is working for you. I always think that your scenes are real-time scenes. So the story is generally going to be told in a progression of real-time scenes. One place, one time, in the present. And then a backstory. I tend not to do like a chapter in backstory. What I do, and this is not to say don't do it your way, but if you're having a question, is I'm in a live scene in a real place that tends to progress in linear fashion, but all through those scenes, people remember things and will jump back into the past. Something triggers it, though, in the real-time scene and jumps back into memory. And sometimes that's the end of the scene, and sometimes you come back into the live scene and go back and forth. You're having a meal with the two elderly aunts, and you're remembering when one of them, like, totally finked on you and you thought you could trust her, and you'll just never trust her again. And then you're back in the scene, and she's passing you the gravy. No, thank you. I'm not taking anything from you, bitch. So, the mind can go anywhere in the real-time scene. So think of the scenes as real-time, and then you do your backstory within a scene. But you could do a whole chapter. You can do a whole scene in backstory. I'm not telling you don't do that. I tend not to do it because I like the movement of the real-time story rather than chapter 2, born, when I was a baby. But plenty of people do it. I'm not saying no, but I like a real-time scene and then introducing the back material within the real-time scene. You can cover years within a real-time scene. But I'm reading a book called Tinkers by Paul Harding that does masterful things with time. And it's mostly, not only is it mostly backstory, but it's mostly another character's backstory. And you just have to read really widely and make notes, read really good stuff, and don't read it like somebody eating a bag of Doritos. You know, if you're a writer, notice how people handle, say, how does this guy handle time? Who's good at time? And then how do they handle it? Read great literature. Everybody has to handle time. Be reading great books and noticing, gee, how does, you know, I don't know who's fabulous right now. I mean, certainly Joyce Carol Oates is a favorite of mine. This Paul Harding I'm reading is fantastic. I mean, everyone has to handle time. So just if that seems to be something you're interested in, keep an eye out for it. What else? Time and chapters. Usually chapter is a big time break. It's a great time to move time forward, is a chapter break. And now it's spring. Now it's 1942. If you have a big story with a lot of time, you can do I do section heads because this is a historical novel where the section heads actually have what time we're looking at. So I give it a theme. So that's the pouring of the wax and the time span of this section of the book. If it's really important, if you're writing historically, that's a really good way to do it. Because then you don't tie yourself in knots saying, how do I tell them when this is? Chapter is when you can change the scale. You can go from just an intimate, tense, real-time chapter, which could have several scenes. A scene, one time, one place, and when you change the time and place, you put that double space. And when you start a new chapter, it's just so-and-so is starting high school. Oh, the last time I saw her, she was, 10. And I'm going down the hall clutching my books in, Rosemary Petersburg High School. Oh, these years have passed. Why not? Why not? So time is very fluid, and it's the best thing about fiction is that it doesn't cost anything to go, a couple of years. You don't need a montage. You don't need to account for it. It's just, there you are. When younger, or less experienced writers feel they have to account for all the intervening points. But just think about, we've seen movies for, all of our lives. When they want to change the time, they just cut. And you're at a new place and you know that time has passed. So let's see, do we have any questions? Here's another question, unrelated, slightly unrelated, why not? We have a question about openings, first pages, and we had a video that was endings and beginnings. So first pages often are not the first thing you wrote. Often it's the last thing you write, because until you know the ending, you don't know what a good beginning is going to be. Sometimes it's the first thing you get, and it's just so perfect. It's just leaps you off into the story. But if you find yourself rewriting and rewriting and rewriting, and you haven't gotten to the end of your draft, you are really spinning your wheels. And that is something that is it's this idea that you're going to get everything right before you get on with it. And my advice is just get on with it. A lot of that rewriting of the beginning is just fear of moving on. Move on. It's not going to be beautiful or perfect. Move on, get to the end of the draft, and then go back. And then you'll go through again, and you'll straighten stuff out, and you'll know stuff that you didn't know before. That is a very common place to put anxiety, is rewriting the beginning of the book. The ending is the hardest. Get to the ending, deal with the ending. And you might not even get the ending the first draft, because the ending is a really tough one. We talked about that last time. So yeah, try not to rewrite the beginning. There is a wonderful novel by Rabi Alaminadine called I the Divine that is all first chapters. It's a writer trying to tell a story, and instead of like just telling it, they keep going back and writing a new first chapter, which is brilliant, because by the time you've gotten to the end, all different styles, all different characters to bring you to the story. By the time you get to the end of the novel, they've told the story in those first chapters. It's such a brilliant book. Super recommend it. Let's see. Here's a question. I've been wondering about a graceful way to describe the protagonist if I am writing in the first person. I have a description that is filled out over several chapters. Is there an elegant solution, or are there no hard rules about this? There are no hard rules about this. The terrible but useful thing, classic, is the character looks in a mirror and they bring their own judgment to what they look like. The important thing is that characters don't look at themselves the way a narrator would, the way a novelist does. The writer would simply describe the person. When you're dealing with first person, it's all spin. It's all their reaction, their take on themselves. So they're going to see something that reflects their character, their take on themselves. So you're never going to get a static description of your protagonist. That's one of the downsides, one of the things you have to know if you decide to do first person instead of third person, is that you cannot pull back and describe your protagonist. They have to do it in bits and pieces. My character, Marina, whatever people say about her, some people find her very attractive, but to herself, she feels that, is she beautiful? She doesn't feel that she's beautiful. She just feels that she's very lively, and her liveliness is what people are attracted to, not necessarily her static features. But you don't have to tell us whether somebody is tall or short. You just have to say, he was my height, or I was taller than her now, or, the friend's mother, asks me to get the cans off the top shelf. Obviously, I'm a tall person. So you just have to be more subtle about it in first person. People can describe them in certain ways. That's that's useful. How you feel or look in relationship to other people. So and so was my height, but so and so stood between us like like the shorter picket, in a picket fence. Let's see. Do we have other questions? Ask me anything. You have any questions about time or use of time or use of chaptering? Chaptering. I usually it's more scenes that are clustered on in a given period or dealing with a certain event and its fallout. So I like short chapters. Here's a question. How do you describe what happens behind closed doors when writing first person? My character is left to speculate, i.e., what did her boss tell her colleague, etc. That is a really good question. So something's happening behind closed doors. Listening, you can hear the shouting, like she can hear her parents arguing when she's been sent into purgatory, into limbo. She can hear her parents arguing. She can hear you can hear doors slamming. You can certainly have somebody who is there tell you something. And you can go there in imagination. If you know people very well, you know that the principal is talking to your mother about your truancy, and you know that the principal's demeanor, you know how she speaks, you know what your mother's going to be doing in there. You can imagine the whole scene absolutely perfectly, and you're in there. I do that a lot because the best, when people know each other well, they do know what's going on behind closed doors. Or you can imagine it, even if you don't know. You can imagine what's going to be happening in there, which is really interesting. Here's another one. How should you navigate parallel timelines in alternate universes? Okay, this is the braided novel that I talked about in structuring the novel. Parallel timelines, you have something happen in, let's say the red planet and the blue planet. Or you could say, John's story and John's son's story, and braid them together. So you go with the story, whatever's happening on the red planet in real time, what's going on, and then you kind of run out of what you want to say about the red planet, and then you're in the blue planet, and you have chapter or two in the blue planet. You can alternate them, one red, one blue, one red, one blue, one red, one blue, or you can do a couple in red, one in blue, another one in red, two in blue, three in red, four, you can, it doesn't have to be boom, alternate, but again, rhythmically, the reader just loves it when you go back and forth like that. And the same thing with, a very good book. I'm trying to think of alternative universe type of stories, but if you scratch that and you go into literary fiction, books that have parallel time schemes, like Possession by A.S. Byatt, and notice how they handle going back and forth, the French Lieutenant's Women, back and forth. So you can find these books on your own and just see how it's handled. But normally, back and forth. Or braided, you can have 3 timelines, 3 stories, if you want. Let's see. Is there another way to do it? Another way to do what? Go back and forth? Not quite sure. What, Alicia, what you're asking. But yeah, the braided story or the alternating story is a very easy way. You know immediately if you're in the blue universe or the red universe. You know whether you're in the 21st century or you're in the 18th century by the character. I mean, you know that these characters are in the present story and these characters are in the 18th century, and that makes it very easy. Hi, Mark. So that's a handling time is something every writer does, and it's worth taking the next 4 books that you choose to read, picking something that seems to handle time in an interesting way, and noticing taking notes of how they handle the time. So I want to thank you for joining me on Writing Wednesday and wish you good writing.